Hey everybody, buenas tardes. It's late today. How's everybody doing today? Today we have a great topic. In case you missed it, let's go ahead and show it right back. Meaningful input and how to make our input more meaningful. So let's go ahead and get started. My name is Scott, and you're watching Immediate Immersion Live, where we're all about comprehension-based instruction in the modern language classroom. We'll be right back. And welcome back, everybody. Happy Juneteenth to anybody who celebrates that. Today is June 19th. It's also the anniversary of my sister's wedding. She was married back in 1999. So happy anniversary to my sister, and welcome everybody. If you're watching this live, go ahead and let us know where you're watching from. Also, if you're watching us from a replay, let us know where you're watching from. I'd love to find out where my videos are going. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to put them in the comments so that I can answer them either live or after the fact later on during the replay. So keep that in mind. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started talking about meaningful input. Last week, we talked about different ways or how comprehensible input and what it was and why it was important and different aspects of comprehensible input to kind of get your minds on that track if you are not already a comprehensible input teacher, or if you were, just a refresher of what that was. This week, I want to put like one step above that, and not only are we working on making your input comprehensible, and remember, that means comprehended by your students, not just because you think you're being understandable. But now we're going to talk about making it meaningful for your students. Because if it's not meaningful, they're not going to pay attention long enough to acquire any language. So it's really important that we work on making our input meaningful. And we have 3 topics that we'll talk about today. And the first are the learner's interests. It is so important that when you are creating your lessons for your students, that you have your students in mind when you do so. What does that mean? Well, first of all, you want to be able to cater to the ability of your students. So that's really important. So you want to make sure that you're challenging your top students, but that you're still engaging your lower students so that everybody in between is engaged in what you're doing. So that's one thing that's important. You want to make sure you're hitting that target of their ability, whether it be a level 1, level 2, or level 3. You have to meet them where they're at. So you might want to do like a pre-assessment just to kind of figure out where they are, because you might be surprised at how much or how little a particular level may know. You may think that a level 3 should know this, 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 and this, but many of them don't because they come from different backgrounds. So instead of, thinking negative things about the previous teachers, just meet them where they are and give them what they need. So that's the first thing. The second is interests. We're dealing with teenagers, and there are so many distractions nowadays with teenagers that we really have to work on kind of entertaining as well as teaching. My generation, we didn't have as many distractions as students do now. I'm sure my teachers back then thought we had lots of distractions, but compared to what we have now, not even close. In their phone alone that they bring in. First of all, they're bringing a phone into class. That was not possible when I was a kid in the 80s. But that phone can also be their game system. Nobody brought their Atari to school. It can also be their TV. Nobody brought their TV to school. It was also their music device. Now, we did bring those, the Sony Walkman, if you remember, but they had big headphones, not as big as the ones now that cover your ears, but a lot bigger than the AirPods that kids now stick in their ears and can hide really, really easily. The other thing we probably had back then was a Rubik's Cube that kids would bring in, or other kind of puzzles like that. But nowadays, kids have a TV, a game console, their music, all in their pocket, as well as, instead of passing notes, which we did back in the 80s, they're sending text messages back and forth. So we are constantly having to fight for the attention of our students. And one way to battle that is making sure that what we're talking about, what we're including in our lessons, are of high interest to students. And how do we know what's of high interest? We ask them. So I spend a lot of time, especially at the beginning of the year, engaging in conversations with my students. I'm finding out what they like to do on their free time, what sports they like, what books they like to read, what shows they like to watch. And most of those shows aren't on regular network TV. They're usually on Netflix or a service like that. So I'm finding these things, the video games that they like, so that I can find ways to incorporate that information into my lessons. And that makes them more engaging because I'm talking about things that they're interested in. What's great about teaching languages is we can talk about anything and it still be on topic for what we're teaching. Math can't really do that. English can't really do that. Science really can't do that. But languages can. We can adapt our lesson to just about anything. I remember a few years ago, the boys were infatuated with Fortnite, the video game, and the girls were infatuated, and I can't think of the name of it, but a TV show that the boys didn't like. And so on conversation days, the boys want to talk about Fortnite and the girls want to talk about this TV show. It was a remake of the Archie comic series, but I forgot what it was. Riverside? Maybe it was called Riverside. I can't remember exactly. But the point was, the boys wanted to talk about that and the girls wanted to talk about that, and nobody wanted to talk about anything else. I needed to find a way to be able to use those two pieces of information to engage my students in our conversations. So what we did is we alternated week after week. So one week we talked about Fortnite, the next week we talked about the TV show. Then the next week we talked about Fortnite, and then the next week we talked about the TV show. So the kids were really engaged in that way, and even if they weren't interested in one topic or the other, they knew the next week we would be talking about their topic. And so it really was engaging for them, and I got a lot of buy-in with that. But how would I have found that out if I didn't ask my students? The boys were all doing the Fortnite dances. They were talking about all the Fortnite stuff. So if you can't beat them, join them. And then the girls were all talking about that TV show. They were all talking about it. They were gossiping about it. They were talking about this character versus that character and what was going to happen. So why not have that conversation in the target language? Another thing, school activities. A lot of kids get excited about different school activities, and like dances and sporting events and field trips, any of those types of things that go on. And we have a lot of those activities in our school. We have concerts for the band. The band goes on trips to Disneyland. We have our dance class that does flash mobs out in the public and competes around. So we can talk about these things. And because my students are involved in these things, that's very interesting to them. And even if, this we were talking about the dance activities or the music activities, and the kids aren't involved in those, they know that I will get to their activity eventually. When we talk about our art gallery that goes on, or when our art students put on murals, or they make art shoes. I don't know how to explain it. They make these really extravagant shoes through art class, and then they model them off during lunch. So we have a lot of these types of activities. So all of these things are the interests of my students. And by using these interests and in talking about these things that kids are interested in, it gets them to pay attention in the language. And often, because we're talking about things that they really like, they forget that we are communicating in another language. And that's one way to make the meaning, or make the input meaningful. Next, let's talk about authentic materials. Now, there are lots of authentic materials, and it's really, really hard to make some of them comprehensible for our students. So you'll want to look up embedded readings for written type text to help make them more comprehensible for students. I have found that to be a really successful technique to use, or strategy to use, when I'm dealing with authentic texts. I don't have time to talk about embedded reading today, but I believe I have some articles and some videos that you can check out both on my website and on my channel that talks about both of those things. But there are so many different things that we can use for authentic materials. You have music, you have texts, you have videos, and you have movies. So those are the basic ones that that come into play. Now, the one that I use the most are authentic songs. So I'm taking songs off the radio that are popular and that are vetted. And what I mean by vetted, I have them vetted by a native speaker. And if you can, multiple native speakers from different regions, because sometimes the slang in the music has a not appropriate connotation. And I might not notice it as a non-native speaker, and it may not be noticeable to Spanish speakers or language speakers from one region to another. For example, there are some songs from Juanes where his is a Caribbean, Northern South American culture, language, and slang that other cultures may not pick up on the innuendo that's in the songs, but anybody who knows that region of Spanish can pick up on it. And I only know this story secondhand, but a teacher was showing La Camiseta Negra in class, and a kid mom was Colombian, and she said, "Oh no, that song is not appropriate for the classroom," and made a complaint. So I always get all of my songs vetted through other teachers, native speakers preferably. That makes it a little easier for me. But I use these songs in all of my levels towards the end of the year for level 1, but in level 2 and 3, they're sprinkled throughout the year to get kids to be able to experience the culture, to see the slang, to see how music is created, and the different sounds and the different beats and the different melodies that the music of my culture that I teach have. We'll talk about the songs, we'll talk about the meanings, we'll talk about the singers or the bands. And that's a great way to get some authentic materials into class. That's very interesting to students because they like music, and they may find music that they might not have otherwise found that they enjoy and that they add to their playlists. The second most common thing that I use are videos, and let's take it back. I want not videos, I want more specific, I want movies. So like Disney movies. So they're authentic in the way that I play them in the target language, and then I'll put English subtitles on the bottom. And by the end of the year, there are certain movies that even level 1 can understand. Nemo is one of them. Finding Nemo is really basic. And towards the end of the year, the majority of my level 1 kids can get about 60 to 80% of that language because it's really, really basic. So keep that in mind when you're choosing movies to play in the target language. Generally, the cartoons, the Disney movies, or the other animated movies are generally going to be a little bit easier for kids to understand. And the closer you get to G-rated, the easier the language. Once you start getting into PG, and if you're allowed to even show PG-13 movies, like Shrek, I believe, is PG-13, the language might get a little bit more difficult. Now, other teachers who teach high school, I teach middle school, so I can't do this, or I've not found a series that is appropriate enough for my students, but I would love to show a authentic TV series. And you find them on Netflix, but they usually have content that is way above my 13 and 14-year-old age limit. So for high school, they work out, but finding them for middle school is really, really difficult. But if you can do that, that's another thing. Show one episode every week or every other week, and the kids can follow it along, and that gets them engaged. The other thing would be videos. And when I talk about videos, I'm talking about like video shorts. You're looking for things on YouTube. YouTube also has closed captions that can help. And what's great about using things like YouTube, you can slow down the speech. So you can slow down the video so that the speech is a little bit more comprehensible at the right tempo for your class. But you can find some of these. I found some prank videos in Spanish, and one of my kids' favorite ones is when a famous skater dresses up as an 80-year-old man and shows up to a skate park complaining about these youth and how the youth is all taking over the park and it used to be a quiet place. And then he says, well, let me try this little skateboardy thing, and gets on the skateboard and then actually wows everybody with all of his tricks. And then he gets back off the skateboard, gets his cane, and then walks away. And everybody's like, whoa. So I love those types of videos. Those prank videos are good. You can also find some commercials. I know one of the commercials my kids like from Christmas time is the difference between Santa Claus and Los Reyes Mágicos, the three wise men. There is a Kmart commercial that I found on YouTube that has a little competition between the two of them, and the motto at the end is, no matter how you celebrate Christmas, you can get your stuff at Kmart. But it is some Hispanic culture, it's got some language in there, some Spanish language in there, and so it's a great way to show some authentic materials. Lesser stuff that I use infrequently, but still I do use, are authentic texts. One of the ones I really like to take is take an excerpt of Don Quixote, which we know right off the bat that's a really complex book. Many college courses spend their entire course just talking about this book. I know my friend who's from Argentina, she took a class on Don Quixote. She said it kicked her butt, even though she was a native speaker. But the scene with the windmills, I like to take that scene and use embedded reading techniques to get it down to its most basic of levels, and then working back up to the original text. It's just a short little excerpt I use, and it takes about 10 or 11 versions before we get to the actual real text. But my kids are so proud when I say, look, this is, Shakespeare's Spanish written, hundreds of years ago, and you can understand it now. And it's an icon not only in Hispanic culture, but a lot of Don Quixote is put into American culture as well. There are a lot of references to it. So I like doing that. In my level twos, we do a myth unit. And on that unit, we read, I think it's called El Quetzal que no se muere nunca, something like that. It's a Guatemalan myth about how the Quetzal bird originated. And it's a short one. It's maybe 2 or 3 pages long in the original. And my twos at the end of the year probably could read about 90% of it without any assistance, but they have some specific words, especially when it comes to Native Americans. Like they have the Indian chief and a couple of other words that are, just not high frequency and would be above their head. So I think we do 3 versions of that where I go ahead and simplify it, leaving off the ending because there's a cliffhanger at the end. And then we do it again. And then I add more words to it. And then we finally, I think on the 3rd, maybe the 4th one, we have the actual text that is actual written for native speakers, and we read that. So these are ways that you can use authentic materials and make them meaningful for your students. Props and visuals. This is another way that you can engage your students in what they are doing. So a lot of kids, hello Helen, welcome. A lot of kids are visual learners, and so props and visuals really help them along. So you can find images or props. I like to collect props. One of my big collections that we started with a couple other teachers a few years ago are hats. So we found funny hats. We found when we were in San Antonio, there was a funny hat store. It's no longer there, but we got the idea and we bought some funny hats. And then you can buy them on Amazon now and get a lot of the funny hats. They've got hamburger hats and umbrella hats and all different kinds of hats that we can use for our story time or to act out a reading or a movie talk that make them very good. The thing with props are it's better to have 1 or 2 really good props for a story than to try to use too many props for a story. And then I have just a prop bucket, one of those big old plastic tubs you can buy at Target, and I put my props in there so they are available and they're near the front of the room and they're easily accessible. Visuals is another thing that you can do. So I have Google Images always ready on a tab on my computer, and I can just slide over to that tab, and then I can go ahead and find an image. So if I need, a really tiny cat or anything, or we're reading something, let's say we're reading and they've got a food item and the kids aren't familiar with what this food item looks like. Like we were reading a novel that had paella in it. So then I went ahead and I looked up paella so that my students could see what it looked like because they're not familiar with that. Or they were talking about blood sausage and I showed some blood sausage and what that looked like. So the visuals really, really help. You also can use music or sound effects. I have a Spotify account. And I have a Google Home in my classroom. So I can either go to my Spotify website and search for something, either a piece of music that I know would really go well with that, or a sound effect that would go really well, or I can just ask Google to go ahead and get that for me. I know whenever we have an evil witch, I can play, Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead. I can just tell Google to play that, and it's right up there on my Spotify, and it goes right ahead. There's lots of different sound effects that I can find on Spotify that work really, really well. But all of these things help engage students and make the input a little bit more meaningful than just the dry lesson that you may have otherwise had planned. So when you're doing your lesson, you're planning your lesson, go through and look. Is there 1 or 2 props that will work well with here? Is there any visuals that I could make? And if you plan them in advance, you might make like a little slideshow so you have the visuals already and you can just scroll through them. You can also maybe make a playlist. So I know I learned from Adriana Ramirez, who's an incredible Colombian Spanish teacher in Vancouver, Canada. She incorporates music from the settings of the books that she teaches. So I have gone ahead and I created playlists on my Spotify. So when we read Me Perdí en Medellín, I got lost in Medellín, which is a city in Colombia. I have a playlist of Colombian music that I can play with that novel that goes with that, or sound effects that I know. I also have a little PowerPoint that I've made with images that work really, really well with that. And then from that, we've also created a cultural slide deck to teach the culture of Colombia, because I want my kids to get really engrossed in that novel and the people and the culture that goes with it. So incorporating all of these things can make what you're doing in your class much more meaningful. And if you have any questions, feel free again to put them in the comments. I'd be happy to discuss them with you. Interactive lessons. Now, everybody says you should not lecture to your students. It's a one-way lesson. And outsiders look at what we do in comprehensible input as being very teacher-centric, because we are talking and the kids are listening. But actually, it's quite the opposite. It is very student-centric. Why is it student-centric? It's student-centric because everything we do in the classroom revolves around the students, their interests, their likes, their suggestions. And we can make it even more so by creating interactive lessons. And mostly, this comes about in two areas. You have your conversations, where you're picking a topic to have a conversation about for the day, and the kids are answering the questions based on their opinions, their ideas, their likes, their dislikes. And so that's an interactive. And then I engage the rest of my class. So if I ask a student a question, and then I engage in this conversation with the student for a few minutes, then I'm going to ask the class about what they just heard to make it more interactive. And then we have our story asking. We don't tell stories because that's a lecture. It's much more engaging coming in with a very simple story plot. I usually make mine 5 sentences. The character, the problem, attempt to solve a problem and fail, and then solve a problem and success. And then the fourth one I forgot to say is I always just have a sentence that says, oh no, there is a problem. So introduces the problem. So I've got my character, oh no, there is a problem, what the problem is, attempt to solve but fail, and then attempt to solve and succeed. So that's my story framework that I use for every single story that I do in class. How we get different stories is because each class answers the questions I ask differently. What type of character are we going to have? Some want an animal, some want a thing, some want a person. The descriptions are different. So this is interactive when we are talking about and co-creating this story together. We can also do something called a write and discuss. And a write and discuss is, again, another way where you can interact with your students. So a write and discuss for me is generally a review of whatever we did in class that day, or sometimes at the end of the week to summarize. And I'm going to ask leading questions to get the information to review, and then I write it on the board, and then they copy it down. So this is another way to get interaction. When you're reading a text, asking kids questions to predict Or what do they think about this character? Or what do they think about what just happened? That's getting more interaction with your lessons, so that your lessons are not just a lecture, that it's a two-way street and you are both learning from each other. That makes it more meaningful for students. Whoops. Close the wrong thing out. So, those are our main ideas that you want to think about. We have got your keeping with your learners' interests at the level that they are, authentic materials and how to make them accessible to students, using props and visuals and music and sound effects to engage their brains, and then our interactive lessons. So all of those are ways that we can use to make our input much more meaningful in the classroom. So it's not just comprehensible and comprehended by all students. It's meaningful so that there's enough interest there for them to want to pay attention, so that they can pay attention long enough to be able to acquire language. So if you have any questions, whether you are live or are watching on the replay, feel free to put them in the comments and I'll do my best to answer them. While you're doing that, I want to talk to you about our CI summer camp that is coming up. So we are offering right now our CI summer camp. It starts in next week on Tuesday. It's a 10-part summer webinar series that we're going to be talking about various aspects to get you ready for the upcoming school year. So right now we have the early bird special for $77 that goes on through this Sunday. And then after that, it'll go up to $97. But at the $77, it's a real steal because you're getting each webinar at $7.70 each. You'll have access to these webinars until August 31st of next year, not this year, next year. So you've got a whole this summer and then all of next year to watch them, rewatch them, reference them. So if you're interested in joining us for CI Summer Camp, you can go to mm.us/summercamp. And from there, you can register for it. I'll put the link here in the chat. So there it is, mm.us/summercamp, and you can enroll for that. If that's something you're interested in, again, it's a 10-part summer webinar series that covers all the aspects of comprehensible input and gets you ready for the upcoming school year. I know many of you have just finished school or are about to finish school for the summer, and you might not want to be thinking about that, but believe me, the new school year sneaks up on you before you know it, and you might want to be just ready. I always get reinvigorated when I participate in my summer professional development. And so if that's something that's interesting to you, please go to mm.us/summercamp to register and read more information about it, see what each of the lessons are. And although we will be going live with all the lessons, we are going to record all of them so they will be available to you at a later time. And close this back down. So I thank all of you for watching us tonight. That is it for tonight. If you found any information that was useful or helpful, I do ask that you please like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. It really does help the video get out to other teachers who might be interested in this information. And I will see you next week, same time, same channel, 5 p.m. Pacific time. And I hope everybody has a wonderful week. Have a great one, everybody. I'll see you next week.